Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Matt McGurk. I'm head of field engineering here at Source Defense. Today we are hosting a roundtable with some qualified security assessors across the industry, experts in PCI DSS and payment page security, which is the specific topic today. In the DSS, we'll talk about that more in specific, but we're talking about web pages where credit cards are entered and they are manipulated or shown or et cetera, and the new requirements around those that are coming into effect here in the first quarter of 2025. So what I'd like to do now is go around the room and ask my guests today to do some quick introductions. Ron, I think I'll start with you, if you wouldn't mind telling the folks a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, great. Good morning, Ron Tosto. I'm with Survetus. We're a small cybersecurity consulting company in the San Francisco Bay Area. Previously, I was with Verizon for many years running the PCI program out there and had been supporting PCI for about 11 years, as well as some other frameworks, and glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure to have you. KJ, maybe I can ask you to go next.
All right, thank you. A pleasure to be here. Happy to be here. So I'm KJ Cedro. I work for a global consulting firm named RSM US. I've been doing PCI assessment as an internal guy and now as an external guy, external QSA, for a total of like 8 years now. So I've been working with a lot of companies of different sizes and different industries. I've seen a lot of different things. And now with the latest release of version 4.0, there's more that came in and more challenges, but also more stuff to learn and to apply. So very happy to be here and very happy to discuss with my fellow professionals here about the new challenges that we have to face pretty much. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. And Daniel, perhaps a few words about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Daniel Barron, Senior Director with Los Angeles office and Security and Privacy Practice in Protiviti. We're a global business consulting firm. Within Protiviti, I'm, of course, part of the PCI practice. I've been with Protiviti for 19 years, QSA for all of these years. Completed numerous validations, gap assessments, and many remediation projects where we helped organizations to achieve compliance. So happy to be here and look forward to answering any questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So let's talk just briefly about format and agenda. So for the audience, what we're going to do here, I'm going to give about 5 minutes or so of just straight presentation about the topic. I would assume that most folks on the phone are at least glancingly familiar with these new requirements, but I want to make sure it's all fresh in our minds for the conversation. Once we're past that, we will open it up for discussion. So our experts today have been kind of briefed. Of course, they're more than familiar with the topic inside and out, but briefed on some topics that have come up on these roundtables over the last year that we've hosted. So we'll talk about those. And I also want to welcome the audience. If you have any questions or thoughts or stuff you want hashed out, feel free to throw that into the Q&A, into the chat as part of Zoom, and we'll work those in as we go. Feel free to submit them at any time, and we'll kind of meld them into the conversation. So without further ado, let me just set the stage for the rest of the conversation here. We are, of course, talking about the payment card industry data security standard and the new revision that went from best practice, or excuse me, that went from draft to the current version to now going through assessments over the last 18 months or so, 4.0 and now 4.0.1. This revision, this new version, has a number of changes. One of the most significant kind of novel things that have been added is what we here at Source Defense call client-side security. That term is meant to distinguish in web applications specifically, is meant to distinguish between what I would call traditional web security, server-side security, and the stuff that happens inside of a web page. Depending on your background, you may call that front end, the front end of a website, or the web pages, or et cetera. But that is a new topic of conversation and focus and scrutiny, is the code inside of your web pages where card data is present. The reason this is a security issue, generally speaking, because there is broad problematic stuff with web pages, but also specific to PCI, is JavaScript. JavaScript is the language that makes everything inside of a web page interactive. So from changing a color to clicking a button to submitting a transaction, that's all facilitated by the JavaScript language. JavaScript, when it was initially specified and implemented in browsers going on 30 years ago, did not have any native security controls or model. The code, no matter where it came from or what it's supposed to do, can do anything it wants to a web page and can access whatever data it wants as the web page is interacted with by the visitor. You may have, if you've got a very keen ear to security matters, have heard the terms Magecart or client-side security. Those are kind of the security world's terminology for it. eSkimming is the term that PCI has latched on most closely because, of course, the goal here is to prevent credit cards from being skimmed off of a web page, just in a parallel fashion to how maybe they would get skimmed off of a gas pump by a hardware skimmer device. You may have also heard the term form jacking, credential harvesting, click jacking. All of that kind of rolls up into this client-side security arena. And so those are all the same thing, is all I'm trying to get at there. Client-side JavaScript takes on many different forms. You have what I would describe as first-party JavaScript. What I mean by that is code that an organization, I'm going to use the word merchant here just for the sake of being concise. When I say that, I do include anybody who's kind of in scope. So merchants, service providers, otherwise you've got a web page with card data, but nonetheless. So first-party code, I would call something that a merchant would integrate themselves or develop in-house. So that's your own code that the organization can control and modify and own the development of, even if that is an open source library or something that gets directly integrated into the web app. I roll that all up into first-party code. The other category that's important to consider is third-party code. So that's things like vendor integrations that are more often than not, especially in the e-commerce realm, used for revenue purposes. They're marketing technologies, they're customer support tools, they're sometimes A/B testing kind of stuff. So analytics, of course, is probably the number one. So all of this code, all of these tools are based on the JavaScript programming language, and thus, as they're running inside of the web page, have unfettered access to the visitor and their experience and their data. The other component of this that makes it tricky to solve for and to manage is the supply chain effect here. So we do have a supply chain, which is, the same concept as you would see it in other parts of security, meaning like, SolarWinds or Log4j a little while ago, or et cetera. You integrate a component into your overall environment, and that thing has relationships and et cetera, et cetera. So that supply chain, the concept's the same. The difference is that it's very, very dynamic and very, very real time. So an organization may know about these third parties right here in this supply chain for a given web page. However, those third parties can and do include their own other parties by reference. So what I mean by that is you might have a tool like Taboola that's installed on a web page that dynamically calls in another tool called Solvi, which then dynamically calls in another copy of Facebook Connect. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is this vendor, Taboola, now has its own analytics tool running on the page in addition to the one the merchant wanted added. So that dynamic third, fourth, fifth party supply chain thing is one of the reasons why, as we look at the DSS requirements, things like inventory and integrity verification and all those things get really complicated really fast because of the nature of this execution environment. Let me give you a quick practical example of what that looks like. So for those of you, I see some familiar names in the audience list. Some of you have seen this before, so my apologies. But what I want to show you here is just a practical example of what the problem is. I'm looking at the New York Times book section for no particular reason, just it's a public website. And if I show you here in the Chrome DevTools, this is under the hood of this web page. What I'm looking at here is all of the JavaScript that was loaded into my web browser at the request of nytimes.com. So you can see here in this second column, a lot of it is sourced from the Times itself. This is that first party code I was discussing before. This code is first party. It's owned by the Times. They control it. It lives on their servers is probably the most important part of it. The rest of this is third, fourth, fifth party supply chain code. And the task before us, we'll talk about this in specific in a moment, but the task before us is to, if this were a payment page, to inventory all this stuff, to have a mechanism to verify it, to have a justification for it. Why is it here? That's the raw, down to the bolts thing that people have to do. The reason we have to do this is if some of this code is compromised and malicious code sneaks in through that supply chain, it can have serious effects. So what I'm going to show you here in a moment next is a simulation of that form of an attack. I haven't done anything to the Times, by the way. I'm just manipulating my local environment to kind of force it to have some malicious code in the supply chain, but nothing has actually been done to the Times themselves. So what I'm going to do here is start the login process. And you can see this black and green box appears. So this is the attack, the malicious JavaScript that has sprung into action. Now, in reality, these things do not have a terminal window scary hacker thing that shows up. They're silent, right? They just kind of do their job, and then the visitor is none the wiser. But for the sake of illustration, I want to show you what's happening as the attack unfolds. So over here on the left in visitor land, I begin my login process, and you can see that this code is, of course, able to capture whatever I type into the form. That's because JavaScript, like I mentioned, doesn't have any security controls. So even though this thing shouldn't be able to do that, it can. The second and probably more dramatic part of this is that this code can modify any part of the web app, the front end of the web app and its behavior. So this form that you see here is not part of the New York Times login experience. This is the malicious code manipulating the web page and forcing a different behavior than would normally be present at this point. So what we're trying to illustrate here is that the problem's bigger than just data management or, inventorying or et cetera. There's a behavioral component to this that needs to be addressed. And the other thing, just to point out specific as applies to DSS, this is the reason, or one of the reasons, in my opinion, that scope has broadened to include pages where a payment service provider's iframe is embedded, because this kind of attack lets an attacker simply replace the native functionality with their own payment form. Because keep in mind, the goal isn't always to break into the thing and be the most sophisticated attack and compromise iframes. It's just to get the credit card number. So simply overlaying something on top of this and then stealing the number is just as effective from a criminal standpoint as being ultra jewel thief, get into the nuts and bolts of the thing. So anyway, when I click proceed to my account here, this attack will send that data to another part of the internet, and then it can be used for direct fraud or anything else. So that is a quick example of why we're doing this, because this problem leaves such a glaring gap in overall web security that mandates attention. The requirements then in DSS are 643 and 1161. So this is language that's specifically meant to address the problem I just showed you. I boil these two requirements down to basically four things. And this is always intimidating to do in front of three experts who know this stuff way better than I do. But in terms of operationalized tasks, this is how I see it. One must, a merchant or a service provider must inventory any JavaScript on your payment pages. And payment page is defined as a page where card data can be entered through a form field or can be manipulated, or et cetera. You have to make sure that those scripts are authorized to be there. So basically somebody knows why it's there and says it should be. And also provide a written justification, which is a technical or business reason for the script to exist on that page. You have to implement a method to assure the integrity of those scripts, so the scripts cannot change or do something different or et cetera without you knowing about it, as well as the contents of payment pages, which are kind of closely interlinked. 1161 is the other cousin to this, is the equivalent section from requirement 11 overall. And this is basically tamper-proofing. There's two strict mandates in here. One is to monitor what are called HTTP response headers. For anyone who's not intimately familiar with the hypertext transfer protocol, that's the metadata that a server sends to the browser along with the contents of the web page. So we as visitors don't see that, but the browser uses that information to do a number of things, one of which is can set security settings. So we have to check those, because if we implement controls that way and they get removed or misconfigured, that could lead to a degradation in security. Also monitoring payment page script contents and the contents of payment pages. So in my opinion, that has a fair amount of overlap with some of the parts of 643, but those are the basic ideas. So when we roll that all together, inventory, justification, integrity verification, and HTTP headers are how I see these things in terms of like, not like, what are the verbs? What does somebody have to do? So that's how I see the overall topic. And now I will take a break from talking for just a moment and open the floor to the real experts. And so I think where I'll start, and I'll just throw it to the team in general, is how are people reacting to these requirements as you're going through assessments? Of course, I want you to be respectful of any kind of, confidentiality or strictures you got, but like, how are people reacting to these, especially this first year that they're new? I don't know, maybe Ron, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, how are the reaction going when you've done a nice job, Matt, of explaining what these two requirements are, and even an example of what the challenges are and what we're trying to fight. This requirement didn't come out of the blue. It's really based on things that, from PCI forensics investigations, we've seen actually happen in the real world. But with that said, they're also one of these two controls are on the more technical side. And so when you first read it, I remember the first time I read the requirement, it was like, what do we have to do, and how are we going to get this done? Because even in 643, it's have an inventory, but now it's have an inventory of the supply chain. Those are two different things. I mean, it's easy to figure out what you're doing in your website, and it's not. And so the reaction is, how am I going to get this done? And I think the consensus is, if you're not a development company in code and web applications, that you need help. So, you've got to come along with some people alongside with you to make sure that this happens. Anyway, that's kind of what I've seen it from a reaction.
Yeah, I would concur with that and say that organizations quickly realize that 643 and 1161 are probably the one of the most challenging additions to 4.0 and now 401. Many realize that, and especially the way the requirement 643 was written originally in 4.0 and how it evolved from 4.0 to 401. There was actually additional kind of restriction on what scripts can be on the page, which has been relaxed in 401. Originally, it said that it only scripts that support payment functionality. Now in 401, it really says that it's anything that's justified for business or technical reasons. So when 4.0 came out, a lot of organizations immediately started to kind of looking at their code at their payment pages. First of all, focuses on scope, minimizing the number of scripts, trying to segment the payment functionality away. For many of the clients we work with, that was the moment when they realized, oh, maybe we should completely outsource that and kind of see how that can work for us. And it definitely was a challenging, one of the most challenging requirements.
Yeah, to add to that, I would say that a lot of clients did not know at first if that was applicable to them. So it was more of making them understand at first that even the user browsers, whatever happened on that side, actually affects them directly. And outside of that, it was more of an understanding on how can they actually perform or actually meet that requirement per se. And I think the how part was the other difficult part. As QSA an expert, we needed to kind of explain to them that there are options out there that they can use, whether it's through like a manual process. But as you said, the inventory of like third-party script, and we're also talking about four-party scripts, becomes very hard to manage when you kind of reach a certain scale. So that part where is the other challenge that we as QSA and expert have to kind of explain to the client that, okay, even though you may find a way to actually remediate the problem, it may be even harder than what you think. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that at first when it came out and what kind of challenges we had to face at first. Yeah.
I think that that's very well said. And I mean, that mirrors my own. I started doing this specific thing at this specific company 6 years ago. And you'd be surprised at the reaction at that point of like, I have what, where? The perception was very much that a web page is like a pane of glass into the server. And it's just like, or to muddle my metaphors, or like a page out of a magazine. When in modern web apps, it's much more like having an execution environment that you have to deal with. It's like, I mean, you can go literally run Photoshop in your web browser right now. That's how sophisticated we've gotten. So they have the security concerns to go along with that. I think something that people kind of a foundational issue here is scope and relationship between merchant, service provider, and some of the stuff that's changed from 3.2 to 4.0. So I guess I'll frame it this way. What's the relationship between, like, who has scope and responsibility in the case of a merchant embedding a payment form with an iframe from a service provider? Because that's changed a little bit, right, between 3.2 and 4. Does anyone want to tackle the expanded scope there?
So maybe I'll start. It is important to realize that even in the scenario where the payment functionality has been outsourced, like leveraging for payment iframe from a PCI validated service provider for payment collection, the referring page still maintains some risk. So it is important to realize that the page that is either performing redirection or is calling the iframe is still subject to that requirement. That code that is calling the iframe, that code that is performing the redirection, could theoretically be modified by an attacker, and security of that code must be maintained. Of course, with the outsourcing, it makes it much easier because the page itself is a responsibility of the third-party service provider. So, but yeah, it's important to ensure that the security of the referring page is included in scope.
Yeah, and then to add to that, just like what you was saying just now. So yeah, as you said, it's easier to kind of transfer the risk somehow to a third-party service provider, but as you would say, the redirection page and all those codes that work on that end need to be taken into account. And I think the biggest confusion there would be maybe around organization actually asking, what about the codes within the iframe? Those actually are our responsibility, and I think that's where the difference is really. So whatever is within the iframe itself is not really applicable to a merchant, but everything else will be.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
And maybe also,
where Daniel, you and AJ are, one of the things, I mean, you're talking about is it's in scope, and it gets into that we, and at 3.2.1, we always talked about, is it process, transmit, or stored? And we kind of inferred there's some security that goes with it. Where 4.0 came in and said, hey, look, it's the fourth element is or affects the security of. And that's, I think, for websites, it's important that we understand that's what we're trying to address, is affects the security of. These scripts have access to those pages, or that has access to the iframe or the redirects. And so even when you look at we're not actually processing PAN, we're not actually doing anything with SAD. What we're trying to protect is, and even though the council came out with 4.01 and said, hey, we're going to relax the requirements a little bit on what script. And when you get to the payment page, and I think this is what's important, right? Is, do you actually need that service for that one page? Because you normally consumer, they're picking stuff, they're putting it in the cart, they're deciding what the color it is. Like those aren't payment pages. Payment pages are, hey, I'm going to pay with PayPal, I'm going to pay with credit card, I'm going to, do ACH, whatever that page where you're putting the information in. And so for that one page, as a merchant, you've got to decide, is it worth the risk? Because, and I like that, Matt, you put in Google Tag Manager as an example, right? So if you go back to Google and say, hey, can you prove that Tag Manager is not doing any foul thing with my payment page? Where they're going to say, well, I didn't design that for payment pages, and I'm not going to justify why you should use it. So that means you as a merchant has to get down to that point of, oh, do I make an exception for this one payment page and not load Google Tag Manager, which then takes the potential risk of anything from Google Tag and fourth party and beyond having access to the security of your page itself. And so that's the important thing to understand in this, is that you're trying to fight the security of and access to, and anything you put in a website that's chosen by your organization, not anyone else. So
those are excellent clarifications, and it's amazing how precise we've gotten over the last 12 months with that, because I think everyone felt a lot of confusion as we went through draft and best practice. Now it's pretty laser focused that it's anything where you embed a form, an iframe, that parent page is in scope. It sounds like we're all settling on the redirect, the page that immediately before the payment process. If you're redirecting, that page is in scope. And I think Ronnie said it really well, which is that it's that shift to affecting the security of, right? Because if the payor, if the customer thinks they're interacting with the brand and thinks they're supposed to put in their credit card number, and one of the scripts that's there takes advantage of that, that's where the problem comes into play. And there was a question that came through, which I think we kind of handled in the middle there, but there's specific language in 4.0.1, which I think was meant to clarify, and in my opinion, may have actually made things a little more confusing, which is to say that this requirement does not apply to an entity for scripts in a TPSP's payment processor's embedded payment form. Gotta take a breath. For example, one or more iframes where the entity includes a TPSP's payment processor payment form on its web page. So I'm going to take a crack, and this is always intimidating. I'm going to take a crack at interpreting that, and you guys can tell me how wrong I am. So what that seems to mean to me as a developer kind of person is an iframe is an embedded web page. And the parent of it and the embedded page are two separate universes. It's basically the same thing as having two browser tabs open. So as I interpret this language, what it means is that a merchant does not have responsibility over the scripts inside the payment service provider's form. I like these head nods. This is great. The other version is my stomach falling out when I get this wrong. So they don't have responsibility over the contents of the iframe, but they do have, the merchant has responsibility over the scripts in their own thing. So from a merchant perspective, that separation of concerns is still pretty clear. The merchant has more scope, but they don't have new scope for the PSP's implementation. And there's another section, I think, basically re-emphasizing that the PSP should be able to prove through AOC or another mechanism that they're doing 643 and 1161. That's a little bit further in this language. Do you guys agree with that? Is that pretty much how you read those things?
Yes, that's correct, and that's kind of in line with what we said, is that the responsibility for the page that's provided by the service provider is the responsibility of that service provider, right? And in fact, also for kind of maybe jumping a little bit ahead, if the service provider providing some of the scripts or the payment page is a PCI validated service provider with the valid AOC, an organization can rely on that AOC for integrity of those components provided by that service provider, right? Kind of speaking of the third party scripts, third and fourth party scripts. And maybe also to kind of to add to the scoping discussion a little bit, is there a way to completely transfer responsibility to a service provider? Yes, and that is in those instances where the entire page, including the kind of a referring page, the pre-payment page, is also outsourced to the service provider. And then, of course, then the entire responsibility is with that entity.
So that would be the case of a straight up, complete, total, full service kind of platform as a service e-commerce thing. I can't control any, I'm a merchant. I can't control any of the code here. I can't do anything else. I can configure products. I can put my logo there, but otherwise it's all on the platform. That's what you're saying, where the scope is entirely on that, the PAS there.
That's correct. Yes.
Makes sense.
I would say that merchants have to be careful in that, it's not a redirect, right? It's you're clicking a button and the website is just sending you to another location, right? Is even that making sure that that page that sends it somewhere out that's completely outsourced, that doesn't change based on your environment. What kind of controls do you have a WAF in front of it? How are you monitoring? Typically, I will see organizations that'll say, oh, that's not we're not accountable, or we're not responsible for a particular control. I would just encourage, really look hard in the mirror and say, do we have some culpability in here? If I was in a courtroom with a lawyer and they said, what does the company do? Because I would tell you, the third-party service provider, their lawyers are going to try to prove it's your fault as a merchant, and that's the reality from if who's going to pay the bills when a breach happens, and so if it comes to you're the merchant, your button sent them to something that's not my website as the third-party service provider. I'm not responsible for how you got them there. That's your bit. So you just really have to answer the hard questions. And then I think the other thing that you mentioned, Daniel, is not just the AOC, but in a responsibility matrix as a merchant, you should look at that responsibility matrix and go to 643 and 1161 and says, there may be shared responsibility, where it says a merchant will be responsible for the page calling up the iframe, but then also that 643 and 1161 has got some third-party service provider responsibility, so that they have acknowledged that, and that the AOC doesn't have those controls listed as an exception as a non-applicable control. So,
yeah. No, 100% agree. That's a great addition, that it is important to consult the responsibility matrix. And having reviewed many of them, often it says that we, as a service provider, responsible for everything that the 643 and 1161 for pages and sites that we manage. You, customer, remain responsible for the page and sites that you manage, right? And so that's again becomes very important to interpret correctly which ones are those and kind of how that risk is organized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the goal of getting our hands around these requirements and putting strong controls in place is that it doesn't end up in that place of, you were supposed to do this, you put that stuff. Like putting strong security controls in there are going to take care of a lot of that. We have I want to do one more on scope, and then we'll pivot over into how to fix this. But I thought this was interesting. Does this requirement apply only to payment pages presenting an input field requiring a full primary account number? What about APIs or scripts used to retrieve the full PAN that is not requiring input fields to be filled out by customers? So the question here is, does it count as a payment page if it's a tokenized thing that retrieves, that does that? Do they have to enter a card number, or do they have to be able to edit a card number for it to be a payment page? I think is an interesting question.
AJ, you want to start, or I'm happy to if you want to defer.
Oh,
Just
you
give
can
you a chance to go first, though.
You can go ahead and start.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, when you talk about, tokenization, don't mix things like API and tokenization. If you're tokenizing, I think it's really, you have to decide where the token happens. And so you see a lot of organizations now that says, hey, if you've given me your cardholder data in the past, we will tokenize it. We will put it in your wallet. And if you're paying from your wallet, then there's not really cardholder data, there's not PAN, that you're really getting away from scope. And so those are the tokenization piece you have to decide. So the first time, if it's the same page, or the first time you get to say, hey, here's my cardholder data, and then any other payments thereafter with that same merchant is off the wallet, then when is it in scope is the first time. If that's the same page, then that page is pretty much in scope, because you could have a customer that could do that anytime. APIs, that you got to remember, because we're talking about, kind of where we're talking really SAQA. There's not cardholder data, there's not PAN, and that piece is if you're processing, transmitting the cardholder data via API, it still becomes in scope. If that API is called from your website as a merchant, that's still your responsibility to make sure that that API is called to the correct location. It has the right security, it has the right certificate. So which are other controls that go with it. But in my opinion, APIs would go in. Pre-tokenized wallets would not. Initial PAN entry would be. Anyway, that's kind of my first digest of that question.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, yeah, 100% agree that tokenized value, of course, assuming that it's a proper token that is not mathematically reversible into the card, that tokenized data is not scope conveying data, right? So once it's tokenized, it's not in scope, and requirements don't apply. Now, when it's pre-tokenization, or when it's kind of tokenization is about to happen, right? What we're talking about is payment pages, and the way they're defined, the payment pages are pages where cardholder data is collected, right? So that's entry of PAN, CVV, name, and expiration date. Those 4 fields, and all 4 fields needs to be, like, if you're eligible for SAQA, needs to be collected by the PCI validated service provider, right? Now, if we're talking about API, that is not that scenario, right? So I think that's when we are kind of going away from a payment page and more into the functionality of the web application at large. And other requirements will be applicable, like secure development and code review and all of those things that will be applicable when we're dealing with just general web app code functionality, not the payment page per se.
I think
thanks, Daniel. I think that's a great amplification of that. Are you calling the API from a page, or are you calling it from the backend script? And those are 2 different issues. We're trying to solve for client browser, and if it's not executed from the browser, then that is not in scope from an API perspective. For these 2 companies.
For me, again, coming from the technical side, it's like, do you have a web page, right? Is it HTML and JavaScript, and does it present that kind? I think one of the things that seems to trip people up in my conversations is they use payment page is the literal words used throughout DSS, the SAQs. And I think, as we all have to kind of do a little literary interpretation with the DSS, I think what the word payment there is doing is meaning payment card information rather than the verb to pay for something. Because like you said, Ron, where like you can update your card in a wallet, that's payment, that's an account number that's going into a thing. You're not settling a transaction, but so that's how I read it, is we're talking about payment in the terms of payment card industry, not payment in terms of completing and settling a transaction, in my own. I got a degree in English literature. I got to roll it out every so often.
Yeah, and I think that's important, because DSS, I think in somewhere in the definition of the page, the language that DSS is using is collection of account data, right? Whether it's collection to settle a transaction at the moment, or collection to update your wallet, or but collection of cardholder data.
Very well said. So pivoting a little bit over to solutions. So this is an interesting kind of scenario that sums up a lot of a lot of the things I've seen out there. So the thing here is I'm a merchant with about 15 public facing payment pages across the enterprise. In your experience, how have you seen organizations trying to tackle solving for that size, that scope, like that amount of stuff? How have you seen folks try to solve for 643 and 1161 for that scenario? KJ, looks like you might want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, from the first approach and the first, how do you call it? Available solutions, for example, will be to go through a content security policy, where they can actually, kind of keep track of the inventory somehow. But the challenge with that is mostly around, when it gets the scope, I mean, it gets really expanded. Like we're talking about third-party script, fourth-party script, and that gets more challenging when it kind of get to a scale where it's no longer really manageable manually. But usually that's the typical approach that organization will do, especially if the smaller organization, they will just go through that route and kind of use that to kind of manage a little bit what kind of script they allow. So yeah, that's a good start for now. That's what I've seen at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe go down. So one thing I've seen when it's kind of a larger scope and there's maybe a retailer with multiple brands or for multiple service lines that have all different payment pages. Some organizations have done some segmenting the payment functionality into a module, and essentially, I mean, payment can be consisting of microservices by itself, but kind of treating that from that terminology perspective, kind of creating this payment module, payment microservice that is leveraged by all of these functional sites, and why this might be a completely different brand and a customer may be selecting dresses, shoes, whatever they want on one site, I don't know, something else on another site, right? But at the back end, the payment functionality might be handled by the same module, leveraging the same payment service provider for SAQA purposes and things like that. So that's one of the trends I've seen.
Yeah, it's the two organizations that seem to be the challenge, right? Is I think as you mentioned, KJ, the small merchants that don't have subject matter expertise, or the funding to bring on, people. What does that look like for them? And then the other side is the very complex, that we handle a different payment page per state or per region or per market, whatever that looks like, right? And so you may have the expertise, but then it's a complex situation because you still got to remember that it's two controls. It's 643 inventory, 1161 monitor and manage, and there's a workflow interaction because in 1161 you say, oh, I found a script that changed. Now you've got to go back to the people that was responsible for the inventory. If that's the same person, great. But if you're in a large complex situation, it's going to be someone else and say, did this change in this web application? And then there's companies that have your marketing department actually runs the website. So who is actually keeping up with the website? And if they're not aware of payments, like, hey, we're just updating a script. We had no idea that it was loaded on a payment page or it was in scope or it's being monitored. So you got to kind of have this workflow of what it is, and right. So the getting to understanding that kind of a background of you don't have SMEs or it's very complex. Do your basics on, which we've already talked about is, hey, if you can, take a script out, change the script, change what the script's doing, how much access does it have to the website, then great. But then you really, you get down to those two scenarios, really small, don't have SMEs, and complex, you've got to get, you got to get this third party help. I've even heard some companies go, oh, because we're internal, we can't actually, we don't have a way to see what is the final web page that actually goes to our client. We can see what comes from app A and we can see what comes from app B. We've got static content. If we're doing some kind of a solution that goes through a content distribution network, you know, what's the final thing that goes to the client? And so if you've got those kind of things, you really have to look at those kind of, how can an organization monitor, even if it's at least the first time. Let's load these payment pages up. Let's just see what the scripts are. Do we know that? Does it make sense? And how do we evaluate that? And there's several organizations, like Source Defense, that can help identify what those are, without, being distracted by all the other internal complexities or lack of expertise on the inside.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And that notion again of web page as magazine or view into the server kind of thing. It's this living document out in the world. And in some ways, once it gets out there, it's you can't know unless you're looking at it in situ, right? In the place where it's executing. You have to observe it there, in my opinion. And like was mentioned along the way, there's guidance in DSS suggesting CSP and SRI for anyone who's not familiar on the phone with those content security policy, sub-resource integrity, basically a whitelisting, blacklisting approach. The browser will forbid the loading of any scripts that are not defined as okay under CSP. SRI is its cousin. It's a hashing technique where the browser will only load known good fingerprinted copies of files that are referenced. And so those two things I usually call as well-intentioned technologies. They work really well in a case where you're building your own web app. You know exactly where it's served from, when it changes, how it changes. You approve all the code, and it's relatively small in scale. As soon as you try to apply CSP and SRI to the third, fourth, fifth party thing, you are, I mean, I'm at a vendor, you can take it for a grain of salt, but like you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're adding so much complexity to your dev team and everybody else, and that intra-organizational cooperation. You're in a situation now where the revenue engine of the company, usually a marketing or e-com or whatever, needs to be hand in glove with app dev and security operations to get new tools approved, to make sure that anyway, you're kind of inviting a little bit of a thing. And especially as we get kind of careened towards the deadline of March of 2025, if you feel like a CSP SRI solution is appropriate for your organization, I mean, I think you have to start like today, like after this phone call or something, because it's going to take a second if you have a reasonably, I mean, there's, like I said, there's places for those techs, but a even moderately sized e-commerce thing is not, in my opinion, the place for them. Let's talk about, let's see here. What else we got?
Just on that, Matt. So I think the council just put something out this week that they're going to have some more guidance on these two particular controls in early 2025. So I certainly would agree with your statement. Like if you're not starting today, you should have started yesterday, but understand that, the council says, okay, we understand that companies are looking for more guidance. And so you should start with what you know today. March 31st is pretty close. But the council's working on some updates for the community as well. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Go ahead, Daniel, please.
Yeah, there is the paper, the guidance paper that council is working on, and there's a group of consisting of QSAs and vendors and other organizations too that work on that paper. And I just wanted to mirror what you said about the CSP and SRI. It's kind of the analogy I use is that it's a knife, but it's not a Swiss Army knife. And what it takes to address these requirements really takes a Swiss Army knife. The CSP and SRI, they do their job, they do what they were designed to do, but that's not everything that is needed to mitigate the risk. And not also even talking about some of the bypasses for the CSP and SRI that exist, this like single page application, right? Within the single page application, there's like a defer attribute, right? That's could bypass, or inline JavaScript, right? So all of these things need to be taken into account when the CSP is implemented, right? And at the end of the day, those are just headers in the page, right? So as long as you don't if you don't maintain the integrity of the page, and somebody, an attacker, gets to that code, that page can, those headers can be compromised along with the page itself.
Absolutely. As we we're in our last few minutes here, sort of. I want to pivot to evidence and kind of what you guys expect to see when you're assessing these controls, et cetera. So we're coming, where I want to start was like timeline. So we're coming up to March. The controls, right, like today, are best practice. They'll become required after that deadline. If you're going into an assessment, so let's say I'm a merchant and I say, my last assessment was on whatever the day is, March 15th of 2020. I'm assessing 2 weeks before the deadline. Does that give me like a year then to wait? Like, until my next assessment's implemented control? I guess another way to sum it up is, if something's best practice, how much evidence lead time would you like to see from a merchant suggesting that they're implementing a control for this? What's the best practice there, if there is one?
Yeah, go for it, Daniel.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I would say that when the control officially becomes mandatory and not a best practice is basically that's the date when the control has to be verifiably, auditably in place, right? So it is okay if it's not completely in place on March 31st, but it is not okay if it's not completely in place on April 1st. So as of April 1st, we need to be able to see and obtain evidence that that control is in place. Now, how we go about obtaining evidence, there can be many ways of accomplishing it, like going from like source code reviews and analyzing the site, Matt, just like you did in the beginning of the presentation, going through what scripts are available on the site. Of course, there are tools to scan it, like the one provided for our gracious host, to analyze the scripts on the page and kind of have the inventory there. So there are many different ways, but basically QSAs will be looking for evidence for each of the bullets in each of the requirements, and making sure that each one is addressed and there's some evidence that we can actually obtain to support our conclusions.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, just like you said, I mean, we're looking at what you mentioned: inventory, justification of each script, and how do they make sure there's integrity of the script. I mean, if I start just by inventory itself, I mean, how long of an inventory do you like? I mean, it's more like a continuous exercise that should have started. I mean, I don't really put a timeline to it. But it should have started a little bit before, so that actually shows that at least there is an inventory of the script that exists. And even just to add the justification to each script, that takes a little bit of time to kind of put together. So I would say, I mean, as of April 1st, I mean, there needs to be something. Hopefully that's something that at least that started before. So at least there is a good list that exists with justification that have been, talked about, discussed, so that it can be shown and as evidence. But again, a timeline to this, I mean, we can't really put a timeline to it. I mean, every organization is different depending on when exactly they started that process or that control per se. So that's really up to any organization out there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the key on that, how long is, when you need to start, you gotta go to 11.6.1. So there's 9, you gotta remember when 4.0 came out, there is 9 targeted risk analysis that relate to frequency, how often you carry out an action. And 11.6.1 happens to be one of those. The council did kind of get out of jail free card. If you don't fill out a TRA, it's automatically 7 days. The other 8 don't have that kind of a preset destination. So if you don't fill out it, if you don't do a targeted risk analysis by 11/6/1, it's weekly. So by the 6th of April, you should have at least one event where you said, I have looked at a payment page. And, you know, as you look at that requirement, the requirement says, hey, do it at least weekly. It doesn't say look at every payment, right? You're really trying to get a sample of, hey, I've looked at payment pages. Does this script look like it did a week ago? So I would say you really have to do minimum. You have to, you know, March 31st, you've got to do your first 11/6/1. Your second one by the 6th, if you go by the default date, you know, but to KJ's point, if you've done a targeted risk analysis and says, hey, we have a WAF and a CDN and all these other protections, we think we can do this every 2 weeks or once a month, then that's where your targeted risk analysis. So how often, how much evidence you're going to have comes there, but you've had to at least done one before the 1st of April 2025. And then the second piece, you know, so it's, hey, we've done a scan. This is the results. We've looked at our payment pages. These are all the scripts that are loaded. You've got to go back to the inventory that you've already created and justified and said, do those things, what we scanned and what is on the list, do those match? Are those the same version? Did it change? You know, kind of pieces. And so you got to understand what those 2 elements are in your workflow of what did you find? Was it authorized? And then so if you go by the default, April 6th, if you have an assessor come in, look at, you've got to hand that inventory with the justification, as KJ said, and then really have that, hey, we did a scan and this is what we found on it. And there's nothing anomalous on that scan that wasn't already on our pre-approved inventory. That's I think the evidence that you really got to think about on those 2 controls and how they work together.
I think that's a really excellent set of practical advice. And I think that's a great place for us to land as we come to the end of our time together. I guess to sum up, it sounds like get a control in place. If you're caught out in the rain on April 1st, it's irrespective of when your assessment rolls around, it will be challenging. And that I think to echo what KJ said, it's going to be per organization. You know, it matches your own operational cadence and what you can accomplish. But, you know, based on my prior professional experience in different parts of the industry, if you're in e-commerce and it's November, 8th, you know, everything else is going to get sucked up into the holiday vortex of selling stuff and code freezes and everything else. So everyone who's on this call, I think, is in the right place, right? Probably headspace of tackling this now rather than letting spring catch up with us before that. So I want to thank our panel here, Ron, Daniel, KJ. You guys obviously have the depth of expertise. Each of your organizations is an immense resource for the community. And we thank you for participating today. Really, literally could not have done this without you. Source Defense is here for anybody who wants to interact with us. Believe it or not, if you want to hear more from me, I am available. We also have some ways that folks can jumpstart their own compliance today. So you can get access to basically our entire platform for free. This will get you started on at very least the inventory component of this. This will take care of it for you without any kind of commitment. Right there, sourcedefense.com/free-PCI, or you can hit that QR code on the screen and see what we can provide for you. I want to thank our audience for their time and attention today. I know everybody's got more stuff to do, and we appreciate you taking the opportunity for us to speak with you. We hope you found it useful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so very much.